Welcome to Leading for Life Stories Season 4. I'm Bob Judson. I'm the host for this podcast, and thank you very, very much indeed for joining me. Whether you're a new joiner or a seasoned listener, then I really hope you enjoy the mix of content that we provide. The personal stories, the thematic episodes, and of course, the fantastic guest interviews. If you've been with me since the beginning, then I'm enormously grateful for your loyalty and thank you so much. If you're relatively new to the show, then I really hope you like it, and I hope you find all of it interesting and some of it hopefully useful to you. Please subscribe on whichever channel it is you're using, whether it's YouTube, whether it's a podcast platform. That really helps us boost the show and get it over the hills on the algorithms. So if you can do that for me, I would be enormously grateful. But without further ado, let's go. Welcome back, everybody. Well, the 40th Personal Stories episode that I've recorded since I started the podcasts more than 2.5 years ago now. And this is the one where I finally reached the end of that Air Force journey that I've been on all that way through those 40 episodes. Actually, more episodes than years in the career. I had 34.5 years in the career, and obviously now I've covered it off in all those episodes. But I thought it would be worth talking about that change, the transition out of the military and into something else. I did a thematic episode back in episode 95, specifically on transition and talking about career changes in the round, and used some of my own experience and examples in that. But I think the story around my exit from the RAF and my journey into Deloitte, and then subsequently the follow-on personal stories that will come into that kind of next chapter of my life, if you like, are still relevant probably to those of you who are interested in some of this stuff, because there are life lessons I think that are valuable, and I hope you get something from that, and that you find this interesting. It was, I guess, surprising on one level when I got to the point that I thought, right, I'm finally going to leave, but also it was in some ways a relief to make the decision. I talked last time in my one about direct joint warfare on the last Personal Stories episode that I was kind of riding two horses. I was riding the leave the Air Force one and also the stay in, and there were options to keep me in until relatively late in the day. And I eventually got to the point where, actually, do you know what? I'm running out of options here. I'm looking like I'm just basically being available for the Air Force to do something with me if and when they decide they want to. But the real risk was I was going to get left on the shelf and have missed the boat, and that would have been terrible. So I was happy to make the decision when I did and avoid that problem. Then enter into what's called directed early retirement. So in other words, we mutually agreed that there were no more jobs for me. So I get a nice letter saying I've been told I'm going to get directed early retirement, which is at air rank is the kind of thing that happens. And I then was allowed very generously a chunk of time on the back of my last job. So when I handed over as Director Joint Warfare, I had in round money 6 months until I actually stopped getting paid. And it could have obviously been a lot less than that because my terminal leave is technically only a month. But the service was very generous about saying, okay, well, let's give you time to sort your life out and exit. And obviously that 6 months was a bit of a whirlwind. I was doing a bunch of things to go through the resettlement process. Even before that, having decided I was going to leave and I was still in the Director Joint Warfare job, I was starting to take some of those steps that would see me on that path. And the good thing about the military exit process is the longer you've been in, then obviously to a certain extent, the more you get in some ways. And the career transition workshop process that I went through was very, very useful. It was 3 days of extremely valuable knowledge input from a variety of different people to kind of prepare you for what's coming next and get you to think about the right kind of things. There are also various other things that you can and can go and do, and I obviously jumped on that bandwagon. So I went up to Manchester Business School. I did the Advanced Management Achievement course up there, which is essentially, it's been likened to a kind of mini MBA. In about 3 weeks, you're doing a very compressed version of that. And that was super useful because the big thing that you're facing, I guess, as even a senior military individual leaving the service, is working in the commercial world where it tends to be more about profit and loss and less about just managing a budget. And so that commerciality and getting your head in the game for that is really, really important. And the next thing is obviously to decide what are you going to do. And for me, that was an interesting journey because I'd never really given it much thought up to that point. And as I started getting closer to thinking, okay, it's time to move, and I'm probably going to leave and go and do something else, a number of avenues were starting to pop up. I started talking to a lot of people, obviously, to kind of look at the different options, get some ideas, get some input. I remember various conversations with great clarity, one of which was with a headhunter that I spoke to very early on in the process, actually. And he was chatting to me about, life at the university and everything, and my CV and those sorts of things. And I said, well, is my CV okay? What do you think? Should I be doing something different? And he said, your CV is just the hors d'oeuvre that gets you to the interview. If you get past that, then the main course is all about, what you've done and what you're going to do and how you're going to make a difference. So your CV is the entry ticket, nothing more than that. So in that sense, it's fine. But actually for you, probably most of the time it's going to be network conversations, and you're going to bypass the filtration process, if you like, that looks through CVs and assesses whether or not you're even worthy of an interview. And that proved to be the case. I mean, it was definitely was pretty sound advice. The other thing he said to me was when he said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I don't really know. I'm kind of pretty fluid about that, to be honest. I've got a whole bunch of skills, and I think I can turn my hand to quite a lot of different things. So I'm quite open-minded about looking around at what might be there that's going to suit my kind of experience. And he smiled, a kind of wry smile, and looked back at me and said, it just doesn't work like that. You are going to have to narrow down what you want to do and be much more specific about exactly what that looks like. And that was one major moment in that whole journey. Another really interesting moment was when I was started talking to Deloitte, and that conversation had come about because actually a friend of mine, still to this day, who worked for me when I was at Coningsby, she was one of my team at Coningsby, was by this stage out of the Air Force herself and was working for Deloitte. And she said, you might want to come and have a look at this because I think you'll find it interesting. And that started that journey into ultimately what became my next job, going into work for Deloitte. But when I was in the kind of courting phase, I suppose, and having initial discussions about it, one of my big wake-up calls was talking to a partner who, a chap called Chris Recchia, who runs the setup and originally and now runs the military talent and transition program that Deloitte run, which is a hugely successful and very powerful vehicle to help people coming out of the military and put them into good roles in Deloitte and indeed elsewhere. They've done a lot of work looking at service leavers in all sorts of other areas. But Chris said to me when we were just having a cup of coffee, he said, you've got a great CV, you've done all these interesting things. What you now need to think about is how you look at your CV, pick the bits out of it that you can turn around and monetize for me in areas of this kind of business that we don't currently have expertise. And that was a whole different kind of lens to look at what I did and how I was going to kind of put myself forward, rather than just sort of sitting on, I've done this stuff, what do you think? It was firmly about, now you need to be making a proposition essentially as to what you're going to bring to the table for a firm like ours. And so that was, one of many of these kind of conversations. And I had, I can't remember, hundreds, probably, I think literally, multiple tens for sure of conversations with people, many of which were extremely useful, some of which were, a bit less useful, only one or two of which were really kind of not that useful. And the way I likened it was everyone gave me a few pieces of jigsaw puzzle. And the closer I got to actually leaving, then the more that jigsaw started to become a picture and I could start to see what was there. And some of the pieces people gave me were corners and edges, if you like, and really useful elements of the puzzle, whereas others were blue sky and blue sea, and it was a bit more difficult to make sense of them. And still they were useful because they still helped to complete the picture. So it was quite a useful analogy, I think, from the way I kind of built my overall transition picture. I was very clear that I needed more than one string to the bow, as it were, as I started looking to exit. So I was definitely looking for other roles as well, and played my network a lot in that space to turn around and say, hey, look, I'm leaving. I'm interested in doing stuff. Any chance of conversations and advice and or potentially help? And as you'd expect, to be honest, the people in my network were brilliant. They were really, really helpful, down to a man and woman, really. I mean, everyone was really great about, making time and having discussions. And a few of them were very actively supporting, looking at, potential roles. And it turned out one of the things I ended up running for, but ultimately pulling myself out of the race for, was a job, quite a big job at Transport for London, which was a really useful alternative to have in the pipe as I was progressing the Deloitte discussion. Because although the Deloitte discussion was going really, really well, and ultimately ended up with me doing a bunch of meetings with people, all of which went very, very well, then there was a suggestion that actually coming in, doing some work shadowing to really kind of look under the bonnet of what we do, and make sure you're happy with us, and to some extent we're happy with you. And it was definitely a bit of a 2 week interview process, because it was a 2 week shadowing thing that I did. And I spent that time looking at the various service lines in the firm, working, or being in the presence of partners and directors right across a range of different roles, and picking their brains and seeing what they thought, and looking at the way the firm operated. And then it turned into, downstream of that, a panel process that I had to go through to formalize it, to actually turn around and write, okay, now we definitely think we want you in, which was a bit demanding, in the sense I hadn't had one of those for quite a long period of time. But at the same time, at that stage, they were firmly wanting it to work as well. So it was definitely a smoother path than it could otherwise have been. It wasn't made difficult for me, but I was extremely conscious that right up to the point that they actually offered me a job that was then going to be one that I was willing to accept, and on terms I was willing to accept, etc., and I'd signed a contract, then it wasn't over the line. And so having an alternative, in play, was really, really important. And I think that was quite difficult for a military person, because I've been in the habit of not doing that, not effectively, riding multiple horses right up to the end of my career, obviously, where I had to start thinking about, I've got to have an exit plan, and I've also got to have a stay plan. And certainly being in the game where I'm very actively looking at different jobs, and I'm not telling them about the other stuff that I'm looking at, was challenging for me. I felt the kind of moral pull a little bit about, do I tell them what's going on? At what stage do I turn around and say, well, actually, this is not being fair to you, because I'm looking at elsewhere, and I'm probably going to take this job if I get offered it, etc. I got kind of slapped around the face a bit, metaphorically, by a few people who said, look, that's just the way it works. You need to be very aware that people will expect you to be looking at other options. They'll expect you to be being pursued by other people, and don't worry about that. That's completely normal commercial reality, which again was one of those kind of wake up calls into the shift. And when eventually the panel process came along, and the job offer was then there the same day, by phone, that's right, this is what we're going to do, this is how we want to set this up. We then need to do some formalities around that, which was really lovely. And it was great to then be in a position where, having had, as I talked about when I did that thematic episode on transition, my slight shock factor on the 31st of May 2015, when suddenly I got my last pay statement, and subsequently got a P45, to say that I was officially unemployed. That was an unusual moment for me, for sure. And it was very nice to be in a position where, okay, now I've passed through that. I've now got another job offer that's in play. It's a job that I think is going to be really interesting in terms of opening up an opportunity for me, and therefore that was really exciting. And I was just delighted at that point that it took the pressure off a little bit, and allowed me to not be spending too much time in the doldrums, because I'd left in May, and actually eventually, by the time I got all the paperwork straight, I started with Deloitte in August. So I had a few months where I was in a gap, as it were, but it was still pretty busy sorting a lot of stuff out to be ready to go and join the firm. And I went into Deloitte recruited in really with two partners backing me, one of whom was the resilience and crisis leader. And that's the business that ultimately ended up sat in, because that was a formed business with a profit and loss account that basically, I needed one of those to have a logistic home. But I was also sort of jointly sponsored in, if you like, by a very senior partner at that point, who was also the global aviation leader for the kind of airline industry, civil aviation side of the business. And that was lovely because it meant that I had, the backing of some pretty senior players to get me in. Ironically, I would have loved, I think, in the time I've been in Deloitte, to spend more time doing aviation, because that would have been a growth opportunity for me. And I'll talk about that in separate episodes. But I ended up really not doing that much of that. I did some, but much more of my time and effort was focused in the kind of crisis management space. But it was, interesting to build a case, to look at actually having to, develop a business case to present as to, this is why you should take me on. Exactly back to that conversation with Chris Reckier about, how are you going to tell us what you're going to do with all your experience that's going to be useful for us in the business. The crisis thing and the aviation thing were obvious avenues for that. Not least on the back of my ACDS ops time, where obviously I'd spent a chunk of time working in Cobra. I'd done a lot of work with the Olympics. Deloitte, coincidentally, had done a huge amount of work with the Olympics on the other side of the fence, so to speak. So that was really helpful in terms of, the obvious link. They didn't have anybody else that had spent lots of time working Cobra and the government's machinery. So, I was kind of a shoe-in for that, really. And the conversation was always around joining as a director, which is one below partner. It was totally unrealistic to even think of joining as a partner. I think that would have been a very short outcome for me, knowing what I know now about the way the firm operates. I was only too delighted to go in, one rung below that, as it were, and have to start, looking at developing my knowledge and building my case. I think the partner level in those kind of firms is a very, very hard landing if you're a direct hire and as a partner. It does happen, but mainly people coming from equivalent kind of jobs in the already in either industry or in another Big Four kind of professional services firm. So director was the right level, and I got there. Once I got all the paperwork straight and everything else, arrived and had to find my feet, obviously. And it was a very interesting process that took me into that kind of first stage, because it was like a one-day induction, which was for all experienced hires, and there were lots of different people going to all sorts of different bits of the firm at that point. I joined in August, so that was the same time as about 2,000 graduates that year, joining from just in the UK, joining it via the graduate entry program. And they did a separate induction process, which was much more detailed, actually. They did an awful lot of extra stuff to kind of build their knowledge. And in many ways, I think it would have been really beneficial to have had a longer process as an experienced hire, because you're, particularly coming from a kind of background like I had, I didn't have a clue really about the way the firm operated. And it was, had to be pretty fast self-taught and leaning on other people and tapping into their knowledge, which I wasn't shy of doing, but it was, it just made it a bit lumpier than it perhaps needed to be. And then I did my compliance and all the process that went with that, which in an audit firm, is important. Even if you're not in the audit bit of it, you still have to go and do all of that work, all the anti-money laundering policies and the due diligence stuff and all the rest of it, and the personal connection side, to make sure you're squeaky clean in terms of all your declarations for your own financial interests and all those sorts of things, so that actually that makes sure that when you're doing client work, you're actually completely on the right side of that. There's no conflicts of interest, etc., etc. And then you're kind of off and running. And the case in those kind of firms is very quickly you're expected to be productive and doing stuff. And you do need definitely to have a mentor of sorts that's going to metaphorically put their arm around you and help you along the way. And I had a couple of those who were really helpful. The people in my team were really helpful as well, in terms of, just actually, hey, look, come and look at this. I'm about to do this particular piece of process. Come and watch so you see how it works, and you can get a handle on what we're actually doing here. So you learn by doing very quickly, and even just on the internal processes. And then it's a story I tell quite a lot in terms of my work now, where Chris Reckier, that same partner, who was a financial services guy by this stage, an ex-army man himself, but from a very long time ago, spent far longer in the professional services world than he ever did in the military. He came to me and he said, "Right, Bob, we need to get you doing some client work and get you out there in the in the kind of core of what we do. So I've got just the job for you. We're going to go and do a job at Barclays Bank." It's an execution risk review. It's all a senior thing. It's going to be C-suite board level. And we want you as part of the team. And I think he was probably looking at me with watching the color drain slowly out of my face at this point, and he looked at me a bit quizzically, "What's up?" And I looked back at him and I said, "Chris, I have a bank account. That's all I know about financial services. I don't have any experience in this at all. Is this going to be okay?" And it was one of those real seismic moments, really. He said, "Yep, it'll be fine." And wind the clock forward a few weeks, it was fine. I dropped into a team that was part of this very busy engagement. The team was very helpful. There was a lot to learn, and it was a very steep learning curve. And it was definitely a sort of drink through a fire hose, as the metaphors go, to actually assimilate everything I needed to do. And my kind of internal imposter syndrome was driven out of me pretty quickly, because I thought, yeah, okay, fine, I can do this. I can be part of the team, and I can play a kind of significant role in the team very quickly. But I still had a bit of external imposter syndrome very early on, because I was looking at the bank paying for me as a Deloitte staff member at director level, so not cheap. The rates are pretty significant, and I thought, do they feel they're getting value for money from this? And it again was one of those really interesting kind of conversations, because I can still remember being in a conversation with some of the senior bank players pretty late in the afternoon, early evening, as it were. We're doing a bit of a wash up discussion, and I talked about this. I sort of said, I'm a bit concerned that you may be looking at me and thinking, what does this guy actually bring to the table? And it was really, really interesting. It was one of those major sort of transitional moments for me, because they looked at me and said, "No, no, 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 you're completely wrong. You're coming into this with non-financial services eyes, as it were, therefore asking really intelligent, challenging questions and pushing us in areas that we probably hadn't thought about before for ages, rather than being kind of potentially in the groupthink mentality." And I have to confess, I just hadn't looked at it like that at all. And so it was a really interesting and significant wake up call to suddenly be in that space where, wow, okay, they really do think that. And suddenly kind of the rest is almost history. I'm off and running, and I'm in there, and I'm now, with some credibility building, credentials building, etc. So the transition process itself was lumpy in parts, smooth in other parts. Overall, when I look back on it now, I think, God, it could have been so much more difficult. And I was really fortunate that I walked out of a brilliant job into another brilliant job. And the title of this episode that I put out there is "When One Door Closes and a Window Somewhere Opens." And that's absolutely true. I think it's what you make it. Obviously, you have to be prepared to get stuck in and roll your sleeves up and get on with it. And I think, particularly leaving from a senior military role, there is a perception that you're going to be coming with a bit of baggage in terms of your expectations, and you feeling you need to be dripping in staff, and people are doing stuff for you left, right, and center, which is not the case in the military now anyway. That's all gone, a lot of those trappings of power. So people are much more ready and willing, I think, to do that roll the sleeves up and get on with it thing. But it's still a big jump. I mean, you're moving from a world that is without doubt totally different into a commercial setting of whatever sort. It's definitely going to be an interesting road, let's put it that way, and with full of challenges, absolutely full of challenges. So I was very pleased to navigate all of that successfully, to be in a position that suddenly I'm now living at home in Sussex. I'm now a daily commuter into London, which I'd been a weekly commuter some of the time in the Air Force, and I'd lived in flats in London and things like that. But I'm now daily commuting to to a job, all pre-COVID, in a world when we did daily commute and everyone was in the office most of the time and so on. But when I look back on that as well, and when I contrast it with today's world, I think, goodness, I was lucky to be in a position where we were all in the office, and it was a team that I could sit there with and learn and absorb what was going on. I think the challenge I would have had if I hadn't been doing that, and if I've been trying to do the same job in a virtual world right from the very beginning of my time, that would have been an enormous problem to overcome. And I'm not sure how I would have done it, if I'm honest. I think that would have been really, really tough. I was always very clear that as I left the Air Force and going to something else, that I would get a job for sure. I'd find something that was going to be good. I was pretty sure it wasn't going to be a sort of anything too mundane. I could preserve, some comfort that I was pretty sure I was going to get a fairly decent job. But I was also very clear that I needed to make a success of that. And I think this has held true actually over time. I think if I had gone into Deloitte and then it hadn't worked and I'd left, let's say after 6 months or less than a year or something, then the conversation into the next set of employment would have been much more about why didn't that work or why did you move than it would have been about the previous 34 and a half years in the Air Force. And so it was really, really important to be successful and to now be in a position where I was off and running, looking like I was going to make a success of it and land well. And so I was very, very happy that that's ultimately what happened. And lots of people to thank along the way, not least Rick Cubworth and Graham Pickett, the two partners that actually had the faith to back me as we went into that sort of the panel meeting. They were the two partners that were looking after me, Rick in the crisis side and Graham as the aviation lead. And I'm immensely grateful to them for having faith in me and believing me and sort of putting me in a position where I could then start building that second career strand. I think that's enough for this episode, just to set the scene for that big transition journey into Deloitte. I'll talk more about Deloitte itself and my experiences there in some further episodes as we get ahead. But I hope that's been interesting. I hope there's some useful nuggets in there, I think, for people to think about. I think, as I said in the transition thematic one, this is an area that is lumpy and difficult. And please reach out to me if you want any help, because if you're listening or listening to this or watching this, then you're in that kind of space yourself, because it's always useful to talk to someone who's been through it, and who can potentially just help you to avoid some of the pitfalls and landmines along the way, as it were. And that's a really important service that I think all of us offer who've been down that journey. We're always pretty happy to talk to others along the way. So do let me know if that's useful to you. I think as well, just being conscious of there's no free lunches here. You definitely are not going to walk out of any kind of career into another career and effectively have a free ride. You're definitely going to have to work really hard to make it successful, to deliver on what people are expecting of you, etc., etc. You can't coast. You absolutely have to be all over it and making sure that you're doing your absolute best to be the best you can be and be super open, ears open, eyes open, wide, on full receive, for everything that's coming to you. Don't sit there on your laurels of whatever else you've done before and too much in your comfort zone. You need to be well and truly stretched, and you will almost certainly be well and truly stretched as you get into this kind of new role. So be conscious of that, because I think it really makes a difference. But as I say, hope helpful, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Bye for now. I really hope you've enjoyed this episode, just as I kind of end the Air Force journey and begin the next journey in my career stories. And I mean, it's been fun to talk about the Air Force stuff, and I'm sure I'm going to come back and talk about some specific elements of it over time as well. But this is now obviously going into that commercial space, which may indeed be even more useful to some people to gain something from the experience I've had there. If it's useful and you're finding it interesting and you think it's worthy of sharing, please share it. Please make sure you subscribe. Please make sure you follow. Please make sure you comment on any LinkedIn stuff you see about this from me. If you haven't connected to me on LinkedIn and you want to, and you're interested in what I do, please do. I'd be delighted to make sure that I'm keeping you up to speed with what I'm thinking about some of these things. And if you really find it valuable and you're getting genuine benefit from listening to or watching the podcast, then please think about the donation side and financially supporting it. The support the show link in your podcast platform or in the YouTube links will actually take you straight to www.patreon.com. and you'll find my site there. You can sign up as either a supporter, a champion, or a patron of the show. And it doesn't cost you a lot of money, but it certainly make a big difference to me. So if you're up for that, I would be hugely grateful. But as always, thanks ever so much either way for listening or watching, and I'll be back again very soon with another episode. Take care. Bye-bye.